Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today is going to be about random mechanics in fights and why it is something that I would like to see done more often going forward. My month from group arrived at the Seat of Sacrifice, or Warrior of Light, whichever you prefer to call it, and this fight is a great example of what I mean with random mechanics. There are a few other examples of this in the game, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on Seat of Sacrifice and Titan Savage as well. Overall, there is some sort of randomness in most fights in the game. If you take a look at E9 Savage, for example, then the first real mechanic that happens is semi-random. It's either stack into spread or the other way around, and that mechanic will repeat itself a few more times throughout the course of the fight, always having some sort of randomness attached to it. And then during the Bramble phase, for example, we also have the anti-air and the wide angle mechanics that can switch places. But unless you're doing the tank invuln uptime strat for that one, you're not really going to change how you handle these mechanics. The only thing that will change is your movement. In E12 Savage phase 1, we also have this with the primals that are channeled by Eden's Promise. It's always random which ones you have to position for, but they always happen at the same moment in the fight. However, in Seat of Sacrifice and Titan Savage, things are a little bit different. There are whole sequences of mechanics that are interchangeable, which do require you to change your approach in how you handle them, and it might not be just for that specific mechanic. In terms of Titan Savage, it would actually affect some of the other mechanics that happen later down the line during that phase. It would change the timeline of the fight, so some of your mitigation might not be up for the next mechanic, or in terms of your rotation, your burst might now be up before the next mechanic happens instead of afterwards, because one of the two possibilities is longer than the other. So it shifts those things around, and you will have to account for that when planning out your rotation. So for Titan, you would basically need to learn two separate rotations, which would account for the two possibilities that the fight had in its phase 1. Looking at Seat of Sacrifice, things generally aren't as drastic as they were for Titan, because it's still just an extreme trial after all and not a savage fight, but it still keeps things interesting. Instead of just knowing exactly what is coming next, you still need to pay attention to which Spectre he spawns, and then you need to react accordingly. It's not like most other fights where you eventually know exactly what is going to be happening throughout the whole fight, and then plan your rotation, which will remain the same no matter how many times you end up doing it. For E12 Savage, for example, now that I've been healing it for the last few weeks, I now got my rotation down for that fight, and unless someone messes up, there isn't really anything that is going to be changing that will affect my healing rotation. But in Seat of Sacrifice, I can't do that, because each Spectre of Light requires a different approach in terms of healing. Mages, for example, don't really require much at all, so just putting up a regen will most likely be enough to handle the whole mechanic, but the Summoner does require you to heal a bit more in the middle of said mechanic. And then depending on which resources you used to deal with that mechanic, you might need to do something else to handle the next upcoming raid wipe or whichever other mechanic might be happening. And it's things like this that keep it interesting for me, especially when looking towards an extreme trial that you will probably end up farming a bunch of times if you're trying to get the mount. Now, I do realize that this isn't something that they can do all the time, and also not for everything. There are still certain rules that need to be followed, like for example, you can't just let a tank buster happen at random, and the same thing goes for raid-wide AoEs. There still needs to be some planning that can be done, because otherwise healers would always need to make sure people are at full HP and shielded all the time, because you just don't know when that next raid-wide would happen. So things like that should still be scripted, but for the mechanical dance that is happening, having some randomness in that is something that is possible, and it is something that I do quite enjoy playing around. But as with everything, there is a time and place for this. Having more semi-random mechanics like E9S's Art of Darkness or the primals on E12S, those things are better suited for savage fights, because those fights require you to play much more optimally in order to clear them, because their enrage is pretty tight, especially during the first few weeks. So it's important that people can plan their rotation around that. And then I'm not just talking DPS players figuring out their rotation, but I'm also talking about healers having to figure out how to best heal the fight so that they can DPS as much as possible, because you will need any DPS you can get when trying to go for that first clear. But in an extreme trial where the DPS check isn't all that tight, that is where it is much more fun having to adjust a bit more on the fly, rather than having everything planned out from start to finish. So I do hope that they do more of that, because when Seed of Sacrifice first came out, it was a lot of fun having to figure everything out, because it felt like you just never really knew what was coming next, and even after having cleared the fight like 3 or 4 times, we still had mechanics that we hadn't seen yet, and that is something that otherwise doesn't really happen unless you always kill the boss before a later mechanic ends up happening. But that isn't really the case for Seed of Sacrifice, because you just need to get lucky with which of the mechanics he decides to give you. Not quite sure if he does all of the different mechanics by the time he reaches Enrage, because I've just never gotten that far, so I'm not too sure about that one. Let me know if that is the case or not, but I feel like I remember that he only does 3 out of the 4 mechanics before Enrage or something, but I could be remembering wrong. It's been a rather long time since I first did the fight. But regardless of that, if you have enough DPS to say see 2 of the Spectre mechanics, for example, then it could be that you see those 2 same mechanics every single time if RNG was to be that way, or you could have a different one every single time you get to that point in the fight, and that is just very fun to me. Anyways, I feel like I've rambled on enough about this. It's just something that came to mind while we were farming last night, so I felt like making a video about it. Let me know what you think about randomness like this. Do you prefer the more semi-random mechanics like E9S or E12S, or do you prefer complete sequences that can be interchanged like in the Seed of Sacrifice, like in phase 1 of Titan Savage? Let me know down below. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.